The silence that broke Hollywood. On November 22, 1963, America did not simply lose a president, it lost its breath. Time slowed, radios went quiet, televisions abandoned laughter and music, and an entire nation seemed to lean forward in disbelief as the news repeated itself again and again, as if saying it one more time might somehow make it less real. President John F. Kennedy was gone. In Hollywood, grief spread like a sudden winter storm, freezing voices mid-sentence and halting careers mid-stride because this loss was personal. Kennedy had not lived at a distance from entertainers. He had lived among them, laughed with them, trusted them, and for a brief, shimmering moment made them feel like they were part of something larger than fame. Frank Sinatra shut himself away, blinds closed, phone unanswered, his voice silenced by shock. Sammy Davis Jr. canceled everything. Peter Lawford unraveled under the weight of grief and guilt. The Rat Pack, once untouchable, suddenly felt fragile and human. Yet while the industry mourned loudly, one man mourned in silence. Dean Martin did not issue statements. He did not weep in front of cameras. He did not cancel his performance that night in Las Vegas. He walked onto the stage at the Sands as scheduled, his tuxedo pressed, his posture calm, his smile faint but present, and delivered a full set to a half-empty room of stunned patrons who could not understand how jokes could still exist in a world that had just broken. Backstage, whispers followed him like shadows. People wondered aloud whether he was heartless, whether fame had finally hollowed him out, whether the man who built a career on charm and warmth had somehow lost both overnight. Dean said nothing. When the show ended, he packed his things, got into his car, and drove through the desert alone, the headlights cutting through darkness that felt heavier than usual. 3 days later, the phone rang on a quiet golf course in Palm Springs, and everything changed. Frank Sinatra was on the line, his voice raw, controlled only by years of discipline. He explained that the Kennedy family wanted music connected to remembrance gatherings surrounding the funeral, not spectacle but dignity, voices that had once brought joy to a president who loved song as much as power. Frank had already secured legends Ella Fitzgerald, Tony Bennett, Sammy Davis Jr., and there was one voice missing, one absence that would be noticed by everyone, Dean Martin. When Frank asked, he expected hesitation at most, a pause followed by loyalty. What he got instead was a word so unexpected it felt like a slap. No, Dean's voice did not tremble, it did not rise, it simply stopped the conversation cold. Frank thought he misheard. He pressed harder, reminding Dean of the moment, the meaning, the history that would be written around those who stood with the family in its darkest hour. Dean listened, said no again, and refused to explain, not to his closest friend, not to the man who had stood beside him through scandals, failures, and triumphs. When Dean hung up, Frank stared at the receiver as if it had betrayed him. By nightfall, Hollywood knew. By morning, America judged. Headlines questioned Dean's patriotism. Radio hosts speculated about ego and resentment. Fellow entertainers publicly expressed disappointment. Some called him cruel, others called him a traitor. Venues quietly canceled bookings. Threats arrived at his home. Protesters gathered outside theaters holding signs that condemned him in bold red letters. Inside his house, the cost became personal. His wife demanded answers he refused to give. His daughter asked why he would let people hate him when he could simply explain. Dean looked at her with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with age and told her that sometimes protecting someone else's peace meant sacrificing your own. He never said who that someone was. He never said why silence mattered more than reputation. He simply absorbed the damage day after day as friendships fractured and doors closed. Even Frank Sinatra, wounded beyond anger, stopped calling altogether. What the world did not see was the weight Dean carried alone, a promise made years earlier in a quiet room, a choice forged not in fame but in fear and responsibility. To everyone else, Dean Martin had turned his back on a fallen president. To himself, he was standing between innocence and chaos, between a fragile truth and a world that would destroy it without hesitation. History would remember the refusal. It would not remember the reason. And Dean accepted that, because some choices are not made to be understood, only to be lived with. That was the moment when Dean Martin stopped being merely a star and became something far lonelier. The man Hollywood would condemn, while never knowing that the silence they hated was the very thing holding something fragile together. The promise that could not be broken. The night after Dean Martin refused Frank Sinatra's call, sleep did not come easily, not because of the headlines already beginning to circulate, but because memory has a way of returning when the world finally goes quiet. Dean lay awake in his Lowe's Angels home, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant hum of traffic, and feeling the familiar weight of a decision he had made years earlier settle back onto his chest. To the public, the refusal looked sudden, cold, even cruel. To Dean, it was anything but sudden. It was the inevitable collision between a promise made in private and a tragedy that now demanded public performance. Somewhere in America, a nation mourned its fallen leader. Somewhere else, far from cameras and microphones, a truth existed that had never been meant to surface, and Dean Martin had positioned himself as the wall between that truth and a world that would tear it apart without mercy. Years earlier, long before the motorcade in Dallas, long before the gunshots that froze history in place, Dean had learned something about power that most people never truly understand. Power did not only reside in the Oval Office or on a Senate floor. It lived in whispered conversations, in quiet threats delivered without witnesses, in the ability to erase people not with violence, but with fear. Dean had seen it up close during the fevered intensity of the 1960 campaign, when Hollywood and Washington blurred together into a single, glittering machine. He had watched rooms fill with laughter while tension hid just beneath the surface, had seen how easily loyalty could be demanded, and how quickly silence could be enforced. That knowledge never left him. It sat quietly in the back of his mind, waiting for the moment when he would be asked to choose between comfort and conscience. As the backlash intensified, Dean's silence became its own form of spectacle. Reporters camped outside his home, hoping to provoke a reaction, a crack, anything that could be turned into a headline. They asked why he would dishonor a president who had supported entertainers, who had welcomed them into his inner circle, who had symbolized a new American dream. Dean never answered, not because he lacked words, but because words, once released, could never be called back. Every explanation he rehearsed in his mind ended the same way, with someone else paying the price for a truth they never asked to carry. He understood something most people did not. Explanations are rarely neutral. They shift blame, redirect pain, and often land hardest on the innocent. Behind closed doors, the pressure turned brutal. His manager laid out the numbers in a flat, business-like tone, canceled shows, stalled films, sponsors quietly stepping away. His agent spoke of studios that no longer returned calls, of executives who suddenly found him difficult, unreliable, bad optics. Dean listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, absorbing the damage as if it were a debt he had already accepted the moment he said no. When they finished, he simply said he understood. That answer frustrated them more than anger ever could. They wanted him to fight, to spin, to defend himself. Dean refused. The fight was never the point. What haunted him most were the personal betrayals that came not from enemies but from friends. Joey Bishop's words cut deeper than any headline. Sammy Davis Jr.'s public disappointment felt like a fracture in a family bond that had survived far worse storms. And Frank Sinatra's silence hurt most of all. Dean had expected rage, maybe even a confrontation. What he got instead was absence, and absence has a way of echoing louder than words. Dean replayed their last conversation over and over, hearing Frank's confusion, his disbelief, and knowing that the one man he wanted to explain himself to was the one man he could never tell. Late one evening, after another day of bad press and unanswered phones, Dean sat alone in his study and opened a drawer he rarely touched. Inside were a few personal items he never showed anyone, letters, notes, reminders of moments when he had chosen responsibility over recognition. He did not read them. He didn't need to. Their presence was enough to remind him why he was doing this. Somewhere out there, beyond Hollywood's outrage and Washington's grief, there were lives that had continued quietly because of choices made in the shadows. Lives that had remained ordinary precisely because secrets had been kept. Dean believed, with a conviction that surprised even himself, that some people were not meant to be symbols, not meant to carry the weight of history's curiosity. They were meant to live, to grow, to remain unknown, and that anonymity was the greatest protection he could offer. When an unmarked envelope arrived at his door weeks later, Dean did not rush to open it. He stared at it for a long time, instinctively aware that it came from someone who understood the cost of his silence. Inside was no threat, no demand, only a few handwritten words acknowledging what he had done and what he had refused to do. There was no signature, just an initial. Dean read it once, then fed it to the fire, watching the paper curl and blacken as the flames consumed it. He did not smile, he did not feel relief. He felt confirmation. The path he had chosen was painful, but it was necessary. As America slowly moved on, as the funeral passed into history and grief settled into memory, Dean Martin remained frozen in the moment of his refusal, carrying a burden no applause could lighten. He understood now that this was not a temporary storm. This was the price of being the man who said no when the world demanded a performance. And deep down, beneath the loneliness and the loss, Dean knew something else with absolute clarity. If given the chance to go back, to hear Frank's voice again on that golf course, to feel the weight of the request one more time, he would still say no. Because some promises are not meant to be broken, even when breaking them would save you from everything. The cost of carrying silence. By the time winter settled over Lowe's Angels, the outrage had cooled into something far more dangerous than anger. It had become belief. People no longer said Dean Martin was confused or grieving in his own way. They said he had chosen his side, and in their minds it was the wrong one. The rumors hardened, gaining details they never possessed at the start. Some claimed Dean had hated the Kennedys. Others whispered about jealousy, ego, even cowardice. None of them knew how wrong they were, yet the certainty in their voices made the lies feel immovable, like stone monuments erected in the absence of truth. Dean listened to these stories from a distance, never correcting them, never softening their edges, because every lie told about him served as another layer of protection for the reality he refused to expose. The strain began to show in ways even Dean could not fully hide. He drank less, slept poorly, and spoke even less than usual. On set, directors noticed his focus sharpen into something almost severe, as if every scene carried more weight than it should. Friends who dared to visit sensed the tension the moment they walked through his door. Conversations stalled. Laughter felt forced. Everyone wanted to ask the same question, and everyone knew better than to ask it out loud. Dean had become a man surrounded by people, yet fundamentally alone, guarding something no one else could help him carry. And loneliness, he discovered, was far heavier than public hatred. One evening, long after midnight, Dean found himself driving without destination, the city lights blurring past his windshield as memories resurfaced with unsettling clarity. He remembered the moment years earlier when he realized that doing the right thing does not always feel noble in the moment. Sometimes it feels reckless. Sometimes it feels like walking willingly into fire with no guarantee anyone will ever know why. That realization had shaped him more than any applause ever could. He had learned that silence, when chosen deliberately, is not weakness. It is restraint. It is the refusal to use truth as a weapon simply because you possess it. The pressure intensified when old alliances began to fracture in quieter, more permanent ways. Invitations stopped arriving. Phone calls went unanswered. Men who once laughed beside him now crossed the street to avoid being seen in his company. Dean recognized the pattern immediately. Hollywood did not punish loudly forever. It punished patiently. It waited for relevance to fade, for opportunities to disappear naturally, so no one could be blamed when a star simply vanished. Dean understood this game better than most, yet he made no attempt to interrupt it. He had already accepted the outcome. Fame, he knew, was never promised, and reputation was always borrowed. Integrity was the only thing a man truly owned. There were moments, however, when even Dean felt the temptation to break. Not for himself, but for those closest to him. Watching his family endure threats and insults tested his resolve in ways public scorn never could. Seeing fear flicker across his daughter's face when strangers shouted his name with hatred forced him to confront the cost of his decision in painfully human terms. More than once he stood alone in his study, rehearsing the words that would end it all, the explanation that would turn anger into understanding overnight. He knew exactly how it would play out. The world would forgive him instantly. The headlines would flip. The story would crown him a reluctant hero. And somewhere else, far from cameras, someone else's life would collapse under the weight of exposure they never asked for. That was the moment Dean always stopped, because the temptation to be understood is powerful, but it is not moral on its own. Understanding often comes at a price, and too often it is paid by those with the least power to protect themselves. Dean believed that heroism was not measured by how many people applauded you, but by how many you protected without recognition. If his silence allowed others to remain invisible, to live without the shadow of scandal, then it was a silence worth keeping, no matter how loudly the world demanded noise. Months passed, the nation moved forward, new crises emerged, new names replaced old ones in headlines. Dean's name gradually slipped from the center of public fury into the margins of quiet disapproval. The damage had been done, but the storm had passed, yet the weight remained. Dean carried it with him into every empty room, every quiet drive, every moment when applause felt hollow. He had not lost his talent. He had not lost his skill. What he had lost was the illusion that doing the right thing would ever be simple. And still, despite everything, Dean Martin never regretted the decision that changed his life. Because regret requires doubt, and doubt never took root in him. He knew exactly why he had said no. He knew exactly what he was protecting. And as long as that protection held, as long as certain lives remained untouched by the cruelty of public curiosity, Dean was willing to stand alone in the shadows, misunderstood, misjudged, and unwavering. The measure of a man. Years later, long after the outrage had faded into half-remembered anecdotes and footnotes in entertainment columns, Dean Martin would come to understand that the hardest consequences of his choice were not the ones he had endured in public, but the quiet ones that followed him into old age. Public anger eventually exhausts itself. Careers stall, then resume in altered forms. Crowds forget and move on. But a man never forgets the moments when he chose to stand still while the world demanded movement. Dean carried those moments with him as the decades passed, not as wounds, but as reminders. He had learned something permanent about himself during that winter of condemnation, something no applause or award could ever teach him again. When time softened, Hollywood's memory and bookings slowly returned, people expected Dean to reclaim his place exactly as before, to laugh louder, drink harder, and prove that nothing had changed. On the surface, he did. The smile came back. The jokes landed. The voice still wrapped itself effortlessly around melody, but beneath the polish, something fundamental had shifted. Dean Martin no longer needed to be understood. He had crossed that threshold already, and once crossed, there was no reason to return. Fame became something he wore lightly, like a jacket he could remove at the end of the night. Approval lost its urgency. He had seen how quickly love could turn into condemnation, and that knowledge freed him from chasing either. From time to time, people still asked the question. Usually quietly, usually after a drink or two, usually framed as concern rather than accusation. Why did you really say no? Dean's answer never changed. He would smile gently, deflect with humor, or change the subject entirely. Those who pressed harder found nothing but calm resistance. It unsettled them. In a world addicted to confession and revelation, Dean's refusal to explain felt almost defiant, but defiance was never his goal. Protection was, and protection, he believed, was only effective if it remained invisible. As the years went on, the people who mattered most began to understand him without explanation. Not fully, not in detail, but in spirit. They saw the pattern in his life, the quiet generosity, the way he stepped in without announcement when someone was in trouble, the way he absorbed blame so others wouldn't have to. They noticed how he avoided exploiting personal knowledge, how he never traded secrets for advantage. These observations never became headlines. They became respect. And respect, unlike fame, does not require an audience. Near the end of his life, Dean found himself reflecting not on what he had lost, but on what had remained intact. He had kept a promise. He had shielded the vulnerable. He had refused to turn truth into spectacle. In an industry built on exposure, that refusal became his greatest act of rebellion. He understood then that character is not tested when choices are easy, but when the right path leads directly through loss. Anyone can be admired for doing what benefits them. It takes a different kind of strength to accept being misunderstood so that someone else can live in peace. When Dean Martin passed away, the tributes focused on his talent, his charm, his effortless cool. Old friends shared stories of laughter and loyalty. Frank Sinatra, standing before a room filled with memories, spoke of a man who kept big secrets and kept them for the right reasons, a man who valued loyalty over reputation and silence over applause. Many in attendance didn't fully grasp what he meant. They nodded politely, assuming it was sentiment, but a few understood. A few recognized that they had witnessed the legacy of a choice made decades earlier, a choice that never sought validation and never demanded recognition. The story of Dean Martin refusing to sing at a president's funeral would always sound mysterious to those who preferred simple explanations. Ego, pride, indifference. Those labels were easy. The truth was harder and quieter. The truth was that Dean Martin measured his life not by how brightly he stood in the spotlight, but by how firmly he stood when stepping out of it. He chose silence when noise would have saved him. He chose sacrifice when self-preservation was available. And in doing so, he demonstrated a kind of courage rarely celebrated. The courage to let history misunderstand you so that someone else's future could remain untouched. In the end, that was the real legacy of Dean Martin. Not the songs, not the films, not the image of effortless charm, but the invisible line he refused to cross, even when crossing it would have restored everything he lost. Some men chase greatness. Others protect it quietly in the dark. Dean Martin did the latter, and the cost of that choice became the truest measure of the man he was. When the truth finally whispered back, time has a way of softening outrage but sharpening memory, and as the years passed, the story of Dean Martin's refusal began to change shape. What once sounded like betrayal slowly transformed into something far more unsettling, a question without an answer. Younger performers asked about it in hushed tones. Journalists revisiting the era sensed that something had never quite lined up. The silence surrounding Dean's decision became more interesting than any explanation ever could have been. And in that silence, tension lived on, not explosive, but enduring like a low note that never fully fades. Dean felt it too. Even in moments of laughter, even during standing ovations, there was an undercurrent he could not escape. Every time someone praised his loyalty, he wondered how differently they would speak if they knew the full weight of what he had carried alone. Every time someone criticized him for that long-ago refusal, he accepted it without protest, knowing that their judgment was the final shield protecting something fragile from a world that would consume it instantly. He had grown accustomed to being the final link in a chain of trust no one else knew existed. And chains, even invisible ones, still pull. Late one evening, many years after the funeral and the fallout, Dean received a quiet visit from someone who did not announce themselves. No reporters, no entourage, just a man who understood that some conversations are never meant to leave the room they happen in. The meeting was brief, restrained, and heavy with implication. Nothing explicit was said, nothing confirmed or denied, but Dean recognized the look immediately. It was the look of someone acknowledging a debt that could never be repaid publicly. When the man left, Dean sat alone for a long time, staring at the door, feeling something rare and unexpected settle over him. Not relief, not pride, closure. That night, for the first time since saying no, Dean allowed himself to imagine what might happen when he was gone. Stories outlive people, so do secrets. He wondered whether the truth would ever surface, and if it did, whether it would arrive gently or violently. He hoped, more than anything, that if it ever emerged, it would do so when it could no longer hurt those he had protected. That was the final act of guardianship, not controlling the truth forever, but delaying it until its power to destroy had weakened. As age crept in and the world around him changed, Dean became increasingly reflective. He spoke less, listened more, and watched younger generations chase fame with the same hunger he once knew, unaware of how quickly admiration can turn. When asked for advice, he never spoke about careers or contracts. He spoke about lines you draw for yourself and refuse to cross, even when no one else can see them. He spoke about promises made quietly being more important than oaths sworn publicly. And sometimes, when pressed, he would say something that left the room uncomfortably silent. If everyone understands your choices, you probably didn't sacrifice much. In his final years, Dean Martin was no longer concerned with legacy in the traditional sense. He had already made peace with how history might remember him or misremember him. What mattered was that the people he had protected had lived ordinary lives, untouched by the cruelty of speculation and spectacle. They would never know the full cost of their safety. They were never meant to. That anonymity was the victory. That ignorance was the gift. When Dean passed away, the world mourned a legend. Friends mourned a brother. But somewhere beyond headlines and retrospectives, there was a quieter mourning too, the end of a watch that had been kept faithfully for decades. The silence he carried died with him, intact, unbroken. And in that silence lived the final suspense of his story, not whether the truth existed, but whether the world would ever be worthy of it. Because the most powerful stories are not the ones shouted from podiums or printed in bold type. They are the ones carried silently by someone willing to be misunderstood for a lifetime. Dean Martin was one of those men, and long after the applause faded, that silent courage remained his most enduring performance. The silence that outlived him. After Dean Martin was gone, something unexpected happened. The noise finally stopped. No more accusations, no more speculation shouted across television panels or whispered at studio gates. Death has a strange way of quieting even the loudest arguments, and in that quiet, the story he never told began to breathe on its own. Not loudly, not clearly, but persistently, like a question that refuses to disappear simply because no one dares to ask it directly. Years passed, and historians, biographers, and journalists began circling the same unexplained moment again and again. Why would a man known for loyalty refuse the single request no one in Hollywood ever declined? Why would someone who built his life on friendship and fraternity choose isolation instead? Files were reread. Timelines were reconstructed. Financial records were examined. And slowly, cautiously, fragments began to surface, not enough to prove anything, not enough to accuse anyone, but enough to make one truth undeniable. Dean Martin had carried something heavy, something deliberate, and something profoundly personal. Those who had known him best began to speak, not in confessions, but in reflections. They described a man who intervened quietly when others were in trouble, who paid for things no one ever traced back to him, who stepped into situations without asking credit and stepped out before anyone could say thank you. Patterns emerged, not scandals. Patterns of protection, patterns of restraint, patterns of someone who understood that power, once unleashed publicly, rarely lands where you intend it to. And the more those patterns became visible, the more Dean's refusal stopped looking like arrogance and started looking like resolve. There was tension in that realization, because if Dean Martin had known something damaging, something explosive, then his silence was no accident. It was a decision made repeatedly every single day for the rest of his life. Silence is not passive. It requires constant effort. It means resisting temptation every time an explanation would make life easier. It means accepting misunderstanding as permanent. Dean did not merely refuse once. He recommitted to that refusal for decades, long after the cameras had moved on, long after the personal cost had already been paid. That kind of discipline unsettled people. It suggested that the truth, whatever it was, had been dangerous enough to justify a lifetime of restraint. What made the story even more unsettling was that no one Dean had protected ever stepped forward. No dramatic tell-all, no emotional revelation, no final twist designed for headlines, just absence. And absence, in this case, spoke louder than testimony. It meant the protection had worked. It meant ordinary lives had remained ordinary. It meant that whatever storm Dean had stood in front of had never reached its intended targets. That realization reframed everything. The silence was no longer suspicious. It was effective. In the end, the suspense of Dean Martin's story did not resolve in a revelation. It resolved in understanding. Understanding that not every truth deserves the spotlight. Understanding that some acts of courage are designed to erase themselves. Understanding that the most powerful moral choices often leave no evidence behind except the damage they prevent. Dean Martin's final legacy was not a secret finally exposed, but a question permanently unanswered, and that unanswered question became the proof of his character. Because if the truth had been easy to tell, he would have told it. If it had only cost him reputation, he might have explained. But it cost him friendships, income, comfort, and peace, and he still chose silence. That is not the behavior of a man hiding from judgment. That is the behavior of a man shielding others from consequences they never agreed to carry. And so the story ends where it began, not with a song, not with applause, not with vindication, but with a quiet understanding that some legacies are invisible by design. Dean Martin did not refuse to sing because he lacked respect. He refused because he possessed too much of it. For people whose names were never meant to be spoken, for lives that deserved to remain untouched by history's appetite, for a promise that only mattered if it was never broken. That is why the real reason never shocked the world with scandal. It shocked it with restraint. And that restraint, maintained to the very end, became the most powerful statement Dean Martin ever made.